Hey guys, if you're coming across my video, I want to talk about adoption. I don't really know where to start. A little bit about me. I was adopted when I was 8 weeks old from a little country called Sri Lanka, which you've probably heard of because of the cricket. So I was very young and I don't remember anything about life before adoption. When I tell people that I was adopted, they sometimes feel sorry for me because I don't know, they have it in their mind that it's a bad thing that one family didn't want me or whatever. Whereas to me, it's just what was. So there's the feeling sorry. There is the curious, they have more questions, which is great. I'm happy to talk about it. Or the one that I don't like is telling me that I'm lucky or I should be grateful because I really don't like people telling me how I should feel. People should feel however they feel because that is how they feel. So if I want to feel sad about being adopted, then that's a choice I'm making, and I don't feel sad about being adopted. How do I feel about being adopted? How do you feel about being born? It's kind of a hard question to answer when you don't really know what the alternative is, right? The first thing that I would want you to understand about adoption is that I had no choice in the matter. Just like any other kid has no choice about whether they were born or not or who they were born to, I also had no choice about where I ended up. One family gave birth to me and decided not to keep me, and another family decided they would like to have me, and that was my family. I understand that not all women want to have children. I understand that not all adults are in a position to have children and to care for those children. And I understand that not all societies work the same, and there's so many factors at play that it was not a personal thing against me at all. I understand that me being adopted was nothing about me. I mean, I was only a few weeks old. I could not possibly have done something to offend people and make myself get adopted, surely. I mean, Mum and I had a great relationship, and I speak in past tense because Mum has passed away. She passed away when I was 16, but I am super thankful for the 16 years that we had together, and I wouldn't change that. So, how do I feel about being adopted? Well, I'm I'm glad. It's just what was, if that makes sense. I find this question a bit of a hard one to answer. The easy answer is yes, that's the simple answer, but I want to make it very clear that adoption, it's a two-way street. People choose to adopt for various reasons, and one of the reasons people might choose to adopt is that they can't physically have children themselves and they want children. And so, just as the parents try to make their child happy and bring joy to their child's life, so does having a child around hopefully bring joy into their lives because that is what they chose to do. Bearing in mind that a child doesn't have a choice whether it's born or adopted, especially if they were only a baby when they were adopted. So, yes, I'm super thankful that I had the wonderful, loving mother that I had. But my thankfulness is not because I was adopted. My thankfulness is because of how she treated me, how she loved me, how she raised me. I never felt like I should be extra grateful or extra thankful because I was adopted. It didn't have any impact on our relationship as mother and daughter. She also, from her side, she never brought it up to me or said anything like, oh, you should be thankful because you're adopted, or, I saved you from this or that. Because giving birth or adoption, that is just the first step and the first choice of a million other choices you have to make when you have a child. And adoption in itself, just like giving birth in itself, it is what you then choose to make it. So it's a two-way relationship. And I am so thankful for my mum, for how she brought me up, for how she talked to me, how she dealt with me, how she connected with me, how she loved me. But that thankfulness is not because I was adopted, but because of the type of mother that she was to me. She was a wonderful mum to me. I am thankful to be where I am today and that I am able to sometimes help other people and animals. And I would not have these opportunities if I was not adopted. But likewise, people who are born here would also not have the opportunities they have here if they were not born here. So it's kind of, to me, it's like asking someone if they're grateful that their parents gave birth to them. I hope I've explained myself right there. It's really hard to get my thoughts out, especially when I'm talking to myself. My father, who adopted me, his side of the family did come from Sri Lanka. So one half of my family was brown. So they could have hidden from me the fact that I was adopted and just said that I came out more brown than white. However, my father left when I was quite young. So it was just me and my mother. And being a chocolate colored baby with a lily white skinned mother, we had different skin colors. She was super white. She was like, her heritage was like British Australian, I think. And people looking at us could see that we look different. I'll just say it like that. Even though mum was white and I was brown, we forgot about it a lot of the time. So when people would be like, oh, why is your mum white? I would be like, well, why is she white? I don't know. Like, it didn't even really, it wasn't a thing that I thought about regularly, and it was never a thing that I held against her. Even as a teenager, I never had that situation where I was thinking, you're not my real mum, because in my mind, she always was my real mum. Knowing that I was adopted did not diminish my relationship with my mum in any way. We were very close, and I always respected her as my mum, and I never wanted to disappoint her. My mum was like a mum and a dad to me. She was also like a good friend and just everything, because it was only me and her. So she would take me out bike riding. She would take me out and play tennis. She would take me out and kick a ball. We would go walking. We would do jigsaw puzzles together. We would do the 9-letter word things together. We would read books together. She was basically everything. We would mow the lawn together. We would clean the gutters together. Our relationship was a very close one, and I am only sad that I didn't get to have that time with her to learn more things from her. On the other hand, my relationship with my adoptive father, I don't think I ever really viewed him as a father because he didn't behave like one. He was in and out a lot of my life. He didn't really take the time to get to know me and my personality. He had the view that children should be seen and not heard. Children should listen to their parents and not have an opinion of their own. Whereas with mum, when I questioned what I was told to do, we would have a discussion about it, and she would listen to my views and I would listen to hers, and there was respect there. And I believe that every family should have respect for each other. And I didn't have respect for my adoptive father, and he didn't have respect for me. My relationship with him was one of dislike and sometimes fear, because he was very unpredictable and I did not know how he would turn up. I didn't know whether he would be loving and happy or whether he would be angry and yell. Sometimes my father expected me to be grateful for the life that he had saved me from. My father did sometimes remind me that I could have been a tea picker or worse things if it wasn't for him. But in my mind, I sort of thought, well, if I was there in that life, I wouldn't have known any different. Like, I don't know what that life could have been like. It could have been terrible. It could have been great. I don't think anyone's child should have to consider any alternatives to being their child. And I think talking like that is a very damaging way to talk to a child. It kind of makes them feel like they don't belong or they don't have a right to be there. A child should never feel that they are any less of your child because of how they came into your family, whether they're a foster child or an adopted child. As soon as you take a child into your family, they are your child, and they should never feel like they're anything else. I believe that the job of a parent is to love their children unconditionally, to make them feel safe and wanted and cared for, whether they came into the family through birth or through adoption or through foster care or whatever means they came into the family. My mum never ever suggested that I owe her anything. She never suggested that I should be grateful. She never suggested that I could have had an alternative life. So obviously that resulted in me feeling a lot closer to my mother. Basically, my relationship with my mum was very positive, very happy, very close, and my relationship with my adoptive father was the opposite. So I did, as a child, receive awkward questions. You know, kids sometimes they just don't have that filter, which actually is kind of great because I prefer people ask me questions than assume things. I'd rather have the discussion and be able to explain or tell things from my perspective rather than people just assuming and thinking things in their head that may or may not be true. Something that mum used to tell me, because sometimes I would get teased at school just because I'm a different skin color, and other kids would see that my mum was white and they would have questions. And as a small child, you don't know how to deal with that so well. So when I would go home crying, mum would tell me, just tell the other kids that my mum had the choice of all the children in the world and she chose me. So I am super loved. If someone happens to come across this video and has any questions, just put them in the comments below and I'll do a follow-up video answering all the questions. Yes, I have met my biological mother and 3 half siblings, as well as my biological grandmother, who's since passed away as well, and some aunts and uncles and cousins, and a whole group of people that I didn't quite understand who they all were at the time. So before I met my biological family, people used to ask if I wanted to meet them, and really my answer was I've already got my family, so I didn't need to meet my biological family. As a child, I thought, you know, if I pass these people on the street, my biological family, I wouldn't even know. They're just strangers to me. And so I would actually feel quite offended when other people would ask me, oh, do you want to meet your real mum? Because I'm like, well, I've got my real mum. Giving birth to a child does not make someone a mother or a father. What makes someone a mother or a father is actually being a mother or a father to that child. So in that way, I did not feel like my biological mother was my mother. She was the person who gave birth to me. So, of course, I was always curious about what do they look like and why did they give me up and whatever, but it wasn't something that interfered with my life. It wasn't a big issue. That was after my mum passed away, my adoptive mum, who was my mum. She passed away, unfortunately, when I was around 16. When I had her, I never felt a desire to meet my biological family because mum was all the family I needed. After mum passed away, and it was about 8 years after she passed away, I felt like, well, I'd like to see Sri Lanka. And so there's no harm in trying to find my biological family while I'm there. And Australia has I don't remember what the organization was called, but I contacted them and it was a free service for adopted children if they wanted to try to find their biological family. So I had them searching, but then I was able to track down my biological family through connections and friends instead. If you have any more questions about that, just let me know, because I don't know if there's any point me telling the whole story if no one's watching anyway. But meeting my biological family, it didn't change me. It didn't change my sense of identity. It was still nice. It was lovely. And we do keep in contact a little bit, but it didn't make me suddenly realize who I am. And it also didn't mess me up in any way. It just was an event that happened and is part of my history, I guess. And again, that didn't change anything about how I feel about my mum who adopted me. She is still my mum and I have always loved her very much. Sometimes people would ask if I knew why I was given up, and I was told that it was because my biological father was married to my biological mother's sister. So he was practicing a bit of, well, he wasn't being a faithful man, I guess. I don't know 100% that that story is true, but that is what I have been told. That is the best information that I have. I also know that my biological mother was not married when she had me, and her mother said that if she had a child that a man wouldn't want her, and so therefore they were going to leave me on the side of the road. And then someone found me and I was adopted. So, one of the questions that people often have is, when did I first find out that I was adopted? In my journey, I don't actually remember when I was told that I was adopted. I just remember knowing it for as long as I existed. It was just always a normal part of my childhood. I just always knew I was adopted, and it was just a fact of life to me, just as you knowing that you were born was a fact of life to you. So it wasn't ever like an issue. When I had any questions, mum always answered them. She never shut anything down. She never was like shady about trying to hide information from me. It was just everything kind of all came out organically as part of conversations. She didn't bombard me with information, especially as a young child. I just knew I was adopted, but I think I didn't really have a concept entirely of what that meant. I just knew that I was born somewhere else, and then they went and got me and brought me home, and this is where I am. But as I got older, I had more questions like who was my biological mother and why did they give me up and all of that kind of thing. And when I was, I think it was maybe 10 or 12, around that time, I finally got to see a photo of my biological parents. I'd never really asked about it before or been curious about it, but one time I asked, and then she brought out this photo and showed me who they were, and I didn't feel any real connection to them. It was interesting to see, but it didn't mean a whole lot to me because, you know, again, my mum who adopted me, she was my mum. So these were just people. I never felt awkward asking questions. Mum was very open. If I had any questions at all, she would answer them as best and as honestly as she could. So I never felt like it was a sensitive or awkward topic at home. I'm really thankful for that mum was really open about it, and that she didn't feel like answering questions about my biological family would in any way impact my relationship with mum. If anything, having those conversations just made me feel closer to mum because we were connecting, we were having conversations, being open and honest with each other. I respected her and I was loved by her and I loved her, and that was our relationship. I think that if I had found out now that I was adopted, it probably would have completely messed me up. Like, I know that knowing you're adopted doesn't change your whole childhood and who was your parents and everything, but I just think that finding out that information in your 20s or 30s, it just it's a lot of information to process, and you probably wouldn't know how to deal with it. I feel like I wouldn't know how to deal with it. I'd be like, well, who am I? And was my childhood even real? And all of these questions that I don't have to ask, because I know I was adopted, and I know that my mum who adopted me, she was my mum, and she has always been my mum because she was the one who raised me as a mother. Another question that I get is, why aren't I more interested in my own culture? And the answer to that is, well, it's kind of a weird question because my culture is the culture of the country that I identify with and that I was brought up in, which is Australia. So, as much as I enjoy Sri Lankan food, I am not the greatest of cooks of Sri Lankan food, and I also really don't know a lot about their culture and their religion and the language even. I don't know much about it. And as a child, I was very much against learning the Sri Lankan culture. I don't know if that was me trying extra hard to fit in being Australian because I didn't want to be different. But at the same time, as much as I like Sri Lanka, I have never felt a strong connection to the country. And I think that is because mum and I were so close, and she was, I think her background was more British Australian, that I connected more with that. than my Sri Lankan side because I didn't really have influences in my life or people that I looked up to in my life who were Sri Lankan. I thought I would talk about a few things that adopted people face in everyday life that you might not think about. So, one of them is visiting the doctor. For example, when you have to fill out those forms about your medical history, as an adopted person, you're kind of like, well, how relevant is my medical history? And that's where it comes down to, like, are these things caused by nature or are they caused by nurture? So, different diseases, different conditions, do they come about by lifestyle or do they come about by genetics? And so it's hard for me to know because as soon as I say I'm adopted, they kind of just disregard all of those questions. And then I'm like, well, hang on a minute, like maybe some of these things could be lifestyle still. I don't really like my mum's medical history to be dismissed simply because I was adopted, because I don't know. I don't know how much influence the lifestyle we had has on my medical conditions, but obviously I don't know my genetic medical history. Another thing is looking at family trees. So, for example, I interviewed my grandparents when I was little and was curious about their history, about how they came to Australia, about their life growing up, and I ended up getting a copy of a family tree on my mum's side and with photos of people. And also someone else on the Sri Lankan family side did a family tree. So I've seen pictures of people from both sides. And often when people are looking at family trees, they'll look at things and they'll be like, oh, you've got the same nose, you've got the same mouth, you've got the chin and the cheek or whatever. The legs, you stand the same. I never had that growing up because I didn't really look like anyone in the family tree. And if something did look the same, that would be coincidence. It's not me getting their eyes or their nose or whatever. I don't think that was a big concern to me. Nobody ever looked at the family tree and then looked at me and was like, oh, poor you, nobody here looks like you. It wasn't a big deal, but it was something that I never felt the excitement of looking at the old photos of people to try to compare to me. Things that people say that frustrate me include that I'm so lucky to have the chance to live here. Because, yes, I am lucky that I'm in Australia, but so is everybody else who was born in Australia or who has migrated to Australia. Basically, where you're born is, in my opinion, just luck of the draw. Whether you're born in poverty, whether you're born to wealth, that is, it's all luck. I am very glad I was adopted, but at the same time, if someone says to me that I'm so lucky to be in Australia, my answer would be, so are you. We're all lucky. We're lucky to be here. Another thing that frustrates me that people say is, oh, it's so amazing that your parents adopted a child. I could never adopt a child. I want my own children. And the part that annoys me is when they say they want their own children. It doesn't matter if someone chooses not to adopt, that's a personal opinion. But when they imply that an adopted child is not someone's own child, that offends me because if you choose to adopt a child, that is your child. Mum never introduced me saying, oh, this is my adopted daughter. She would introduce me saying, this is my daughter, because I was her daughter. I am her daughter. And I never introduced her as my adoptive mother. She is my mum. Yeah, I don't like the whole I want my own children line of thought. I get what people are trying to say, that they want to have their own genetic children. I think that if you have the attitude that an adopted child will not be your real child, then I very much hope that you do not adopt, because that would not be fair for the child. If people ask me where I'm from, I don't know if they mean which country am I from, as in which country am I a citizen of, or if they're asking which state in the country that I grew up in, or if they're asking where I was born. Sometimes I'll just say, oh, I'm from South Australia because that's where I grew up. And then they'll be like, oh, but where are you really from? And then I'll be like, well, I was adopted from Sri Lanka, if that's what you mean. It is annoying sometimes when people ask that where are you from question, because I am from here and it's just that I look different. And I think it surprises people too sometimes when I tell them that my mother's side of the family are dairy farmers. and that as a child I very much enjoyed visiting the farm. So really, when people come up to me in everyday life and ask where I'm from, what they're actually asking is, why do you look different? And the reason I look different is because I was born in a different country to different skin colored people. But if I have children here in this country and people ask them where they're from, well, they're from Australia. And so I think people need to kind of be a bit mindful when they notice differences about other people. Like, I don't know, is it even people's business where people were born? Like, maybe you could start the conversation with something else, like, how are you? And get to know me and then ask me those questions. The answer to the main question, should you tell your children they're adopted? My opinion is yes, and my opinion is to tell them as early as possible and just make it natural. Make it just part of their everyday life. I think by telling your children or your family early that they were adopted, it becomes just part of their natural identity, and it's not so much of a big deal. Versus if they find out when they're older, it kind of could make them question their whole childhood and their whole identity. And I think people are much more likely to have a crisis about themselves, who they are, where they come from, if it hasn't been part of their whole journey through childhood, their whole life story. For me, being adopted was part of my story. It was part of me, and it always has been. I didn't really question where I came from because I knew I came from multiple places, and I'm Australian who was born in another country, adopted from another country, but I don't question my roots or who I really am because I know who I really am. Knowing that I was adopted became part of who I really am, if that makes sense. And I think hiding that from a child or feeling like they can't process it at a young age could cause more problems later on. For example, if I had only found out, say, when I was 10 or 13, I think there could have been more issues in my psyche. I think it could have been a lot harder to deal with and process as a teenager, even though by that stage I really knew what adoption meant. Just processing that I was adopted then as a shock to my system versus knowing my whole life that I was adopted, but gradually finding out little bits and pieces of what adoption meant and little bits and pieces about my own journey as they came up, as the questions came into my head. It was a much more organic, natural way of developing that part of me. I think too, I mean, I was an only child, but if I had have had siblings, I think it would have been very stressful for everybody if I found out later, because then both myself and my siblings could have been questioning, well, like, are they really my siblings? Are you really my parents? Those kind of questions that never crossed my mind. Even with my cousins, for example, I never really questioned, like, are they my real cousins? Because I'd just grown up knowing that I was adopted, but these were my cousins. And that's just how it is. All my family is my family. And whether or not we're blood related, that doesn't matter, because the fact that I've known that they know that I'm not blood related, but they still treat me as family because I am family, it means that I don't have all these questions about who I am, who my family is. Was anything real? Were people lying to me? Who knew and why didn't I know? And all of those things that would come up. And I think too, it makes me a lot more grounded and comfortable with the fact that I was adopted. I think if they had have hidden it from me and told me later in life, then I would have felt like it was perhaps even something to be ashamed of, because why were they hiding it? It could have made me feel like now I'm less part of the family, and also perhaps even a bit betrayed because all these people knew this thing about me that I didn't even know. And that, I think, could have been quite stressful and quite confronting. Of course, that's just my experience and my opinion. There might be other adopted people out there who feel differently, who perhaps feel like they would prefer to have never been told. I don't know. I can only speak from my own experience and knowing that I was adopted and I was loved. That's just part of me. If I have children, I would definitely tell them I was adopted. Obviously, it doesn't change anything in our family dynamic, but I just think it's part of my life, it's part of my history, and it's just something that they should know about me. And I think telling them early on would also just make it a natural part of their history too. For example, I wouldn't want my children to grow up and then suddenly in their 20s find out that I was adopted, and then they start questioning where their whole lineage comes from, and they want to go to Sri Lanka and try to find all these long lost relatives and have this midlife crisis trying to figure out who they really are. I would prefer that they know from a young age that I was adopted. Yeah, like they will hear about mum because she was and is a very important person in my life. And they will also know that she adopted me and she chose me to be part of her family. And I was. So I don't think that there's a reason for me to hide that from my children. I think it's part of my story, and it's important for children to know their parents' stories and where their parents came from, and it forms part of their identity as well. Being adopted is never anything I've hidden from anyone. All my friends knew. I didn't introduce myself to people and was like, "Hi, I'm Larry, I'm adopted." But I just think it always came out in conversation somehow or other. I'd be surprised if there was any of my friends who didn't know I was adopted. I think most people who meet me pretty quickly in our relationship find that out. What do I think of adoption in general? I think that there are many parts to it. So there's a lot to consider. I think adoption in general is a wonderful thing, but I also understand that it is not for everybody, just like having children generally is not for everybody. And I think something very important to take into account if you're considering adoption is whether you are physically able to be there and support a child who might feel like they don't fit in with the society that you have brought them into. So, for me, being a brown child and pretty much always being the only child of color in my class, and mum having to deal with me coming home every night crying because I was being teased at school. You have to be prepared for those kinds of moments. I think, too, you have to be very prepared and willing to be able to listen and acknowledge that you don't know everything and you don't understand perhaps what the child is going through. When I think back, my mum was white and she was beautiful. I don't think that she could have understood from a personal perspective what I was going through at school, because she was someone who would never have been teased because of her looks. And yet she managed to be there for me and support me in everything that I was going through. And she never really told me how I should deal with it. She was there for me to get my feelings out to, and she was just there for me to give me space to grow in myself. And I think that sometimes as a parent, you won't always have the answers for your children. And sometimes what they're going through might break your heart because, especially if they're an adopted child, you might not be able to fully put yourself in their shoes and know what they're feeling. And so I think it's very important to be prepared to listen to what they're saying, and even if it doesn't make sense to you, just to be there for them and support them through it. And don't tell them that what they're feeling is wrong. For example, if you think that society should not view them that way, they're feeling that way. So whatever they're feeling, that is right for them to feel. And then we have to work out how to deal with it, how to make sure that they feel loved and supported, and how to make sure that they have the tools to keep going in the society they're in, to make sure they have a good support network, and to make sure that they feel that they can ask whatever questions they want to ask, that you will be there for them in their journey of life. The other super important thing about adoption is to remember that once you adopt a child, it is your child. It's your son. It's not your adoptive son. It's your daughter. It's not your adoptive daughter. They are your child. And you have chosen to support them no matter what. no matter whether they choose to take a different path in life to the path that you would have hoped for them, unless they do something crazy and turn into something terrible. And by that, I mean like a murderer. Okay, let's cut that out. You know what I'm trying to say. That's another thing. Don't take it personally if they are curious about their biological family. It doesn't mean they don't love you. It's natural for children to be curious about everything. I think that there is room in a child's life to love you completely and still have questions and want to learn about their biological family. And that doesn't take away from you being their mother or their father. It doesn't stop you from being their parent, their guardian, the person that they look up to for their whole lives. And I think the most important thing is to be honest. Never lie to your children. If they can't trust you to tell them the truth, then who can they trust? How are they going to face a whole world and a whole society when they feel that they can't trust their parents to tell them the truth, to support them, to be there for them no matter what? And that is all that I have to say on that. So if by any chance some person comes across this video and has questions, just comment them down below and I will do a follow-up video at some stage answering any questions if I get any. And yeah, I'll leave it at that for now because I can't really think of anything else to talk about in regards to being adopted. Well, that's all for now. Thanks for listening. Let me know if you have a different opinion to me or if you were adopted and you found out later in life and whether you think that was a good thing or not. I'd be curious to know because, again, I can only speak from my own experience. And bye.